The Spurs have just returned from Paris, Ethan. And as much as there were some very fun moments in that trip, there were also some very bad ones. That's kind of what we left on. But I think it's ironic because I feel like both of these two games encapsulate how it feels like this season has gone for the Spurs. As much as there's been some games and losses that have been closer, than the blowout that we saw in game 2, we saw the best and the worst of this year's version of the Spurs in Paris, Ethan. And it was kind of ironic that it was in Paris, just of course, with the connection for Victor, as well
Mhm.
as CD. You got to see those new courts that Victor unveiled out there in his hometown. It was a full circle moment in a lot of ways. And it was also a full circle moment in regards to how this season has gone. Does that analogy make sense?
Oh, for sure. It feels like the overall theme has been inconsistency this season for the Spurs. And, game one, we win by 30. Game two, we lose by 38. And it's at any moment, depending on which game you watch, sometimes you feel like, okay, we're ready to compete now. Let's make a big trade. Let's go for the finals. Like, we're ready. And then the next day, you're like, okay, this is kind of, why the Spurs want to quote unquote play it slow, right? And continue on this path of rebuilding for the future. Um, it's frustrating for sure, but I think if you like we said last time, zoom out and look
Right.
at it, from a 20,000 foot view, this is kind of what we expect it to be, right?
Yeah. No, it's year 2. And
Yeah,
so you're yeah, and it's great because it was the same team back-to-back games. I mean,
yeah,
it's not great in that sense, but it's great from an evaluation standpoint because you can see sometimes and obviously, the hype and the upped ante being in Paris with this kind of just being, really in a sense for Victor. Like there have been other international games that the different teams have played, and some of that does kind of have to do with some sort of connection, like the Suns played in Mexico City, for example. But this was really like Wemby's homecoming in a
hmm
sense, for the first time when he was in the league. Um, and so yeah, and you got so obviously that I think plays into the first game's result. Like Victor was
hmm
really hyped up, the whole team was really hyped up. But also that was the Spurs at their best. That was
hmm
the most connected that they had looked all year. And I'm not just saying that because it was in Paris. Like we've been watching these games for most of the year. And as much as there have been some other blowout wins this year for the Spurs, I mean the that was the closest to beautiful game ball movement that I've seen, really since because we saw some spurts in the DeJounte, DeMar, LaMarcus era. Like I'll give them some credit. Really, since then, when there were still some remnants like Patty and Rudy Gay, that did kind of play in that end of the era with well, obviously Patty was there the whole time, but like Rudy was there in that Kawhi era,
hmm
in 2016 and 2017, that were still remnants of that. And that was the closest thing that I'd seen to it. In that game, just 4 to 5 passes each possession, and just everybody else contributing off the bench. And I guess this can kind of lead us into talking about that game. But also, as just to wrap up what we were talking about in the beginning there, that was an example of how you could see the best of what this team can be. But then also the next game
hmm
against the same cast of characters, literally the same roster, you can see the opposite result happen. And I know we're over what, like Chris Paul said, we're over that young guy stuff, like he said. But also there is still a growing process for this team, when it comes to getting success around Victor Wembanyama. And it is still year 2. And game 1 was an example of how we've seen some improvements. And game 2 is also an example of how we still need some improvements in those areas, which I think really, again, like you said, it just comes down to consistency, and building consistency takes time.
For sure. I think that this was probably the closest like 2 game stretch for Victor in terms of like what the playoffs will feel like. Same team back to back, same location. First game, it felt like we kind of caught the Pacers slipping, and that's what Rick Carlisle was talking about. He was like, we kind of were treating this like a vacation almost, and then by the
Yeah.
time the game started, we were like, oh crap, like we have to play a game. And so they looked kind of flat too, and then our energy was so high. We have the French connection, so we just looked extra great on top of all of that. And then that
Hmm.
second game, that's just what you expect from a young team come playoff time, right? Is the inability to adjust to high intensity players. And the Pacers have a lot of veterans. They have playoff experience, and they came out from jump pressing us full court
Mhm.
the entire time, and we just could never recover. Like, we could never comfortably bring the ball up the court. There were a couple times the refs let us get away with an 8-second violation. I don't know if they changed the rule on that. Maybe it's 10 seconds now. But like, there were literally like 2 or 3 times in a row where the shot clock was down to 15 seconds and we hadn't crossed half court, and I was like, "Huh, I guess I
We
just
we
feel
were
bad
playing
for us."
European rules. I don't even think that's a
Maybe.
rule in the European rules, but just they let some stuff go since Victor was in town for sure.
For sure, yeah, but like they were playing aggressive with
That's a
Wemby,
great point. Yeah.
which is what he struggles with so far in the season, and they were just denying Devin Vassell the ball,
Mhm.
and maybe we could have done something, as a coaching staff to get him more like better looks, but he only took 6 shots overall, and they really just let Stephon do what he wanted to do, and then he wasn't very efficient. 7 of 20, 1 for 4 from three, and you don't expect guys off the bench like Jeremy to go 1 for 5, and he felt MIA the entire game. Like they
Yeah,
really
the second one.
yeah, eliminated him in that second game. But it all kind of connects back to what you were saying is like this is the best and the worst of the Spurs. And if somehow we're to sneak into the playoffs, I would expect a result kind of like this. You can
Yeah.
only hope that the Spurs learn from this loss. And if we do get into a playoff or a playing situation like that, we're more ready for the kind of intensity that will be brought to us because it's not a one and done, right? Like we can't just play one great game great and then, you know, lackadaisically walk into the next one. Like there's
Right.
a certain intensity that you have to carry over from game to game. And Chris
Mhm.
Paul did talk about that.
Yep.
We were just unable to do it in France, which is unfortunate.
It's something that the Spurs are still trying to build, and
Yep.
that's kinda, the next step, obviously. And I think, at least in regards to the play-in specifically when it comes to this,
Hmm.
there's pros and cons. I mean, it's kind of like a coin flip. Which
Hmm.
team shows up, it'll benefit you in that sense. If
Hmm.
the good version shows up, then you'll advance a game depending on where you're at, or you'll win the one game that you need to get in, depending on how the standings go in. I think the Spurs will probably definitely be in that 9 to 10 range as the season has gone on. But just for the sake of conversation, um, with the plan, that could go well. But also, if you get the performance that we saw in game two, that could also be to your detriment and you could go home in one game. And that's kind of, for example, if we go back to the Oklahoma City Thunder before last season when they really popped off, they were in the 10 seed, and I believe that they lost that game, if I'm remembering that correctly. So
Hmm.
um, that is, also just kind of a part of the process when you're trying to build something. I know people might not like to hear that, but that's that just is what it is when it comes to this. It's not 2K where you can just automatically, fix everything in a couple of moves.
Right. Right.